if you are making improvements, whether it's under pressure from consumers or critics of globalization, foreign governments or domestic governments or whatever the case may be, you need to actually be able to demonstrate and report out that that's actually taking place. Probably the poster child for good, quotation marks, corporate responsibility here was the Nike Corporation. So Nike came under a lot of pressure about 12 or 15 years ago about the working conditions in many of the factories that produced their shoes. These were not Nike factories. They did not own the factories, but these were subcontractors in places like Indonesia and more recently in Vietnam and Bangladesh and a variety of South and Southeast Asian countries. And under that pressure, Nike has gone to a great deal of effort to actually bring in monitors to assess the working conditions, to report on those independently of what the company is saying, but also to report out what the results are, and to try to convince consumers that indeed what we thought of were really awful working conditions are now at least less awful, if not good, but generally much better working conditions. So this kind of pressure, these informal agreements, can actually work. Then we can also think about country responsibilities. In here we can think about the country that's doing the importing, which from our perspective might be the U.S. In here, the president actually does have a great deal of power to affect trading patterns. So the president can actually ask for a report on the working conditions in foreign countries, and he can, through executive order, withhold trade privileges from countries where they're not meeting the particular standards that we're looking for. Now, the problem with that is that the executive order would apply to all imports from that particular country, even if there was only one industry within that country, or maybe only several firms within that an industry within the country where there were egregious misdeeds taking place. So unfortunately, it's a really blanket kind of issue. So the country responsibility becomes very difficult, especially under the more formal issues. And that, of course, means that we have to be very careful. It is not kind of a surgical strike. It's also much more of a meat cleaver when we do that. We also have a tendency, in part because of the political pressures involved, that whatever takes place abroad gets compared to what takes place domestically. And as we know, working conditions, labor standards, labor productivity, and wages will be very different domestically than they will be internationally, especially for countries further down on the development scale. And so countries like to kind of punt on all of this because they just soon, by and large, when I say countries, I really mean the national governments of countries, like to punt on this issue and turn the whole thing over to international organizations or non-governmental organizations. So the International Labor Organization, which is affiliated with the United Nations, but concerns itself with labor issues around the world, is often brought in or asked to monitor labor standards in a variety of different places. NGO work actually proves to be relatively effective in terms of getting changes in behavior. In part because non-governmental organizations also seem to have more clout or credibility with consumers in developed countries than do governments themselves, even though the conditions might be exactly the same. So I think this whole notion of labor standards is a very difficult one for most people. We can think about the pure economics of it, the mutually beneficial exchanges. We can think about the rapidly rising wages. But it's hard for us in the developed world, I think, to look at these kinds of pictures and think about what it must be like for the workers in that part of the world. There are no shortcuts that I'm aware of, however, to economic development. Yes, you can do it very quickly. China's in that process now. But it took 50 years for Japan to move from being where China is today to where Japan is today, which is about 75% on an income per person basis of where the U.S. is today. So it takes a couple of generations at best to get to sort of developed country wage levels that also allows you the luxury of buying, if you will, safer working conditions, better working conditions, shorter working hours, and all of the other kinds of benefits that come with that. Clearly, the playing field is not level by any stretch of the imagination. It's not fair in however you want to define the word fair, but it is what it is, right? And so one needs to figure out how to deal with it. In the economics of the issue suggests that trade may not be the only way, but is at least a very powerful way of helping countries to grow very rapidly and to also raise their level of economic development. Okay, so a second issue about globalization, this one has less to do with the WTO, is cultural identity. One of the things that has been talked a lot about, especially back in the 80s and the 90s and the first part of the last decade, was how homogenized culture was, right? Go wherever you want to go in the world, you can probably find a McDonald's, right? You can find Coca-Cola, you can find Pepsi-Cola, and mostly what you can find just about anywhere in the world is American products. You don't necessarily travel all over the world and find Japanese products or French products or German products. So not only has there been some pushback about the homogenization of global culture, but there's also been a great deal of pushback about the fact that most of the homogenization is Americanization. And as Americans, quite frankly, we ought to be embarrassed by some of the things that we have exported to the rest of the world. So in the entertainment industry, does anybody know from 1990 to 2003, the single #1 television program that raised the most money from exports to the rest of the world? $1 billion a year in royalties from Baywatch. Now, as a red-blooded American man, I'm embarrassed by that. But my apologies to the rest of the world. But this is, and we know that American music goes everywhere, American TV programs, American movies go everywhere, American, lots of other things, products and all sorts of stuff. Now, what I said was that this had actually happened primarily from roughly 1980 through about 2005. But in the last 10 years, maybe even a little bit longer than that, there's actually been a flow in the other direction. And that flow in the other direction really has to do with the fact that we have much better and cheaper communications networks. So, right, when I was your age, which wasn't that long ago, I know it might look that way, but it really wasn't. I'm a lot younger than I look. But when I was your age, I think, I went to college in Southern California, and I think we had 9 TV channels. That was it, right? How many do you have today? Just on your TV, and don't count the internet, right? Well, I get the cheapest package that you can get because I'm an economist, right? So I get the cheapest package I can get from AT&T, and even if you eliminate the duplications, because I get regular and high def, and I'm not sure you should count that as 2 different channels, even under that program, I still get 350 different channels. 350. It takes me half an hour to channel surf through all of them, right? And then, of course, it's the half hour so the programs change. But one of the things that I noticed is, since I'm relatively uneducated and I speak no other languages than English, and some people don't think I speak English very well, but so I was going through my TV a couple of months ago, sort of saying, let's just skip all these channels that are not in English, right? I don't understand what's going on. And then I went through and I counted all the non-English channels that I eliminated, 78 of them. I didn't count how many different languages that was, but it was a whole bunch. I mean, Spanish, obviously, but I mean, there was Korean and Japanese and Mandarin and Cantonese and Farsi and Arabic, and to say nothing of French, German, Polish, and a bunch of other European languages. 78 of my different channels. So what we're finding now, and now go onto the internet, and you've got this other entire explosion. So now when we start looking at cultural differences, we find that, hey, cultural differences are being broadcast all over the world. It is not an exclusively Americanization of global culture anymore. And in fact, it's a much less, I believe, there's probably still too much, and if you're not an American, you probably think there's way too much, but there's clearly been a rise in cultural identity in other countries. Oddly enough, we talked back when we were talking about arguments in favor of protection. Remember, one of them was national pride. And I gave you the example of France, how France actually has tariffs on certain products because those industries, like wine, those industries are industries in which France has historically had a comparative advantage, but they take a great deal of pride in having had that industry for several hundred or maybe several thousand years. But many countries have actually been pushing back in this culturalization issue in terms of actually using trade barriers to make sure that they have their own music industry, TV industry, movie industry. Those are the big three generally. So Canada gives subsidies too, because other trade barriers are generally not permitted, to generate their own TV programs and their own movies. And we don't see many Canadian movies here. But Australia for years and years has had a fairly small but fairly vibrant movie industry, right? Now they send all their movie actors and actresses to the US, right? So what does that tell us? External economies of scale, right? All in one location. Okay, let's move on. WTO. So, whole bunch of criticism about the WTO being the world government. So the WTO has been an informal organization only since 1994, as we discussed last week. And in the last 15 years, the rapid pace of economic growth has lifted more people out of poverty, absolute number, lifted more people out of extreme poverty than at any other time in the history of mankind, and womankind for that matter. So it may be true that one of the things that we know from international trade is that there will be winners and there will be losers in every country. Right? Even under the best of circumstances, going along the lines of comparative advantage, that some people are going to, if not lose outright, specific factors model, are going to lose because they're going to have to change what industry they work in. So farms may have to shrink. Farmers may have to move off their farms to an export-oriented industry. So the question really is this something that the WTO forces on the world? Or is this something that the world or members of the WTO have accepted? Now, it was obviously pointed out in one little scene there that if you don't join the WTO, we won't give you aid, we won't do this, we won't do that. I have no idea whether that kind of stuff happens behind the scenes or not. I suspect that there probably is some of that, but there are a number of countries that haven't been members of the WTO or GATT before that, including some fairly significant countries. In fact, China only moved into the WTO 10 years ago. Russia is not a member yet. They're trying to become a member, but they're not a member yet. Saudi Arabia is not a member. So there are countries, not everybody's a member of the WTO. It is an organization, and there is a treaty. And there's no doubt in my mind, anyway, that most of the treaties and agreements were written by developed countries, and generally people write things with an agenda in mind. But that doesn't mean that it's not subject for negotiations later. The WTO is a supranational organization, very much like the World Bank or the United Nations. By the way, votes are taken. You can't ratify a treaty without a vote being taken. And what we see, though, especially in the dispute settlement process, that what the WTO does is to push countries to live up to their so-called international treaty agreements, which just happen to be the World Trade Organization, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, the TRIPS, the intellectual property stuff, the agricultural stuff, all of those types of issues. Remember, the WTO does not have a police force, it does not have an army, it has no tanks, it has no airplanes, it has no bombs. It can give another country that has been subject to unfair trading practices, it can give those countries a waiver to impose trade policies that otherwise would be against WTO rules. So for instance, if one country were to apply a tariff, and let me give you an example of one that actually happened. In 2004, I'm sure this had nothing to do with the fact that that was an election year, President Bush, and I'm sure it had nothing to do with the fact that he was running for re-election, imposed a tariff on a wide range of women's garments from China. Nightgowns, brassieres, shawls, I don't know, there were 10 or 15 different items. And it was a tariff because there had been a huge surge of exports from China of those products to the United States. So under something called the escape clause, the president decided that we would put on temporary tariff protection. China protested this to the WTO. In the preliminary ruling from the WTO, the U.S. lost. And before it could go to a final approval, the election was over, and the president won re-election, as you probably know, and they took the tariffs off. Now, I said I didn't think this had anything to do with the election. There was a reason I said that, and there's a reason the United States actually lost that case. It was really obvious. There was not a single product that the tariff was actually levied against that was made in the United States. Not a single one of the products was made in the United States. So there was no domestic import competing industry to protect. So what's that all about, right? So the WTO would have granted China, if the United States had not removed its tariff, it would have granted China a waiver to impose a tariff on American imports of the same dollar value as the tariffs that we were imposing on Chinese exports. And so to give you another example, this is outside the WTO, this has to do with the North America Free Trade Agreement. Inside the North America Free Trade Agreement, Mexican truck drivers are supposed to have the right to drive their trucks on American highways. The U.S. Teamsters Union, truck drivers union, and many U.S. truck companies don't want the competition and have said Mexican truck drivers are less safe, Mexican trucks are less safe. This isn't a trade protection issue, this is a highway safety issue. Mexico pushed the issue. There's also a dispute agreement inside the NAFTA, which looks very similar, by the way, to the WTO dispute settlement process. So Mexico took it to the NAFTA dispute settlement, and the dispute settlement people said, aha, this is something we can test. They requested that the U.S. government have, and the U.S. government did have, a pilot program for Mexican trucks coming into the United States. There was 100, I know it sounds like a lot, 100 Mexican trucking companies. There were about 1,000 trucks and truck drivers involved in this pilot program that lasted for 2 years. And the police and the Department of Transportation monitored all of these Mexican trucks operating on U.S. highways. Their finding was that Mexican truck drivers had 23% fewer accidents operating on North American roads than American truck drivers did, and that Mexican trucks failed their truck exams 17% fewer times than American trucks did. So at least on the pilot program, the trucks were safer and the drivers were safer. Now, that doesn't mean that that would have been true of all Mexican trucks and all Mexican truck drivers, but at least under the pilot program, you can't argue that American truck driver or Mexican truck drivers were less safe. So Mexico then went back to the United States and requested the right to move Mexican trucks on U.S. highways. And the U.S. said no. So they took it to the appeals process, and now Mexico has tariffs on 400 different American products, including, by the way, Christmas trees. That's the only thing I remember is the Christmas trees. And it's an average tariff rate of something like 15%. So they tried to figure out what was the value of not allowing what was the value to Mexico of not allowing Mexican trucks to operate in the U.S. They estimated that at $1.2 billion per year. So Mexico got to put a tariff on that would raise about $1.2 billion in tariff revenue. Right? So it's, again, I don't have an army, I don't have a police force. I can't force the U.S. to change their rules, but I can allow there to be some sort of retaliatory action. Notice that the tariff by the Mexicans would have not been permitted under the treaty except as a response to the other party's deemed illegal action. So this is what I mean by when we say we're requiring countries to live up to international agreements. In the United States, all trade agreements are treaties. They have to be obviously negotiated by the president and the administration, but they also have to be approved by a 2/3 vote in the Senate. So they do come up for a vote in the country. One of the knottiest issues, and if I were a resident economist in a developing country, this would be my big issue, is developed countries impose a lot of domestic policies that actually have significant international trade consequences. But those domestic policies themselves are not always subject to international trade negotiations or rules. As an example, in the United States, we heavily subsidize our agricultural sector. That's a production subsidy. It's not per se against the World Trade Organization rules to have production subsidies. But of course, what happens when you have a production subsidy is you expand your total production. If you're a net exporter of that product, that also increases your exports, which will have the tendency, if you're a large country, to drive down the world price. So if you're now an export competing country, you also have a comparative advantage in some of these agricultural products. The world price has been driven down, not because of a trade policy in the U.S., but because of a production subsidy. Yes? Well, I can't think of a single case where a fine has been imposed that it's actually been paid. So my guess is if they have been, and I'm not saying none of them have ever been paid, I just don't know of any that have. My guess is if they're paid, they go to the WTO to, in the general operating fund. I mean, it is an organization, they have employees, they got to pay the people. Yes?
What do you think about the argument that the sweatshops that are happening in North countries are actually kind of like monopoly buyers of labor and are not operating on especially efficient wage structures?
Well, I would say I think there are very few cases where you could say that the monopsony power was that significant. In part because when we look at where most of the